Welcome, crew, guys, gals, ghouls, friends, fiends, foes, whoever may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. Secure your tinfoil hats, buckle down tight, and hold on loosely as we soar over the rocky tops of the La Platas on a rocky mountain high, get sucked into the vortex of the Four Corners, and settle down snugly at mile marker 420 in colorful Colorado. It is Sunday, November 24th, Monday, November 25th, for those of you across the pond and beyond. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. I'm your host, TessaTNT, and we are broadcasting live from the Mile High Clubhouse tonight. If you're listening live right now, you may be listening to us on Spreaker under We Are Paradox Media. You can also find us on KPNL Radio, which you can find at kpnlradio at kpnl-db.com, as well as YouTube. If you don't mind, mosey on over to our YouTube channel, like, and leave a comment or a smiley face or whatever you like on any video that you've watched or listened to. And leave us any comments, whether good or bad, and let us know what guests you'd like us to have on or what books you'd like us to read. And I will try my hardest to get that done for you. So tonight is story time with me, TessaTNT. Tonight we are getting back into Stephen King's book, Insomnia. Look at that poor old guy. He's tired. I don't know if you guys suffer from insomnia, but I sure as heck do. And ain't it grand? Alrighty, let's get into it, shall we? Well, you're an industrious bugger, I'll give you that, Weiser said, and waved a hand at the blue boxes. These things are nothing but antihistamines. Essentially, they're turning on a side effect. Antihistamines make people sleepy. Check out a box of Comtrex or Benadryl down there in the decongestants, and it'll say you shouldn't take it if you're going to be driving or operating heavy machinery. For people who suffer from occasional sleeplessness, a Sominex every now and then may work. It gives them an edge, but they wouldn't work for you in any case because your problem isn't getting to sleep, it's staying asleep, correct? Correct. Well, can I ask you a delicate question? Well, sure, I guess so. Do you have a problem with Dr. Litchfield regarding this? Maybe have some doubts about his ability to understand how really pissy your insomnia is making you feel? Yes, Ralph said gratefully. Do you think I should go see him, try to explain that to him so he'll understand? To this question, Weiser would of course respond in the affirmative, and Ralph would finally make the call, and it should be Litchfield. He saw that now. It was madness to think of hooking up with the new doctor at this age. Can you tell Dr. Litchfield you're seeing things? Can you tell him about the blue marks you saw shooting up from the tips of Lois's fingers? The footprints on the sidewalk, like the footprints in an Arthur Murray dance diagram, the silvery stuff on the tips of Joe Weiser's fingers. Are you really going to tell Litchfield that stuff? And if you're not, if you can't, why are you going to see him in the first place, no matter what this guy recommends? Weiser, however, surprised him by going in an entirely different direction. Are you still dreaming? Yes, quite a lot in fact, considering that I'm down to about 3 hours a night. Are they coherent dreams? Dreams that consist of perceivable events and have some kind of narrative flow, no matter how kooky, or are they just jumbled images? Ralph remembered a dream he'd had the night before. He and Helen Dipnew and Bill McGovern had been having a 3-sided game of Frisbee in the middle of Harris Avenue. Helen had a pair of huge, clunky saddle shoes on her feet. McGovern was wearing a sweatshirt with a vodka bottle on it. Absolutely the best, the sweatshirt proclaimed. The Frisbee had been fluorescent green stripes. Rosalie, the dog, had shown up. A faded blue bandana, someone hung around her neck, flapping, and she limped toward them. she had leaped to the air, snatched the frisbee, and gone running off with it in her mouth. Ralph wanted to give chase, but McGovern said, "Relax, Ralph. We're getting a whole case of them for Christmas." Ralph turned to him, intending to point out that Christmas was over 3 months away, and to ask what the hell they were going to do if they wanted to play frisbee between now and then. But before he could, the either ended or gone on to some other, less vivid mind move. "If I understand," Ralph replied, "dreams are coherent." "Good. Well, I also want to know if they're lucid dreams." Lucid dreams fulfill 2 requirements. First, you know you're dreaming. Second, you can often influence the course of the dream. And if you influence the dream, the direction it takes, you're more than just a passive observer. Ralph nodded. "Shove those. I seem to have a lot of them lately. I was just thinking of one I had last night. A stray dog I see on the street from time to time ran with a frisbee some friend of mine and I were playing. I was mad that she broke up the game and tried to make her drop the frisbee just by sending her the thought, sort of telepathic command. Oops. He had a small embarrassing chuckles by Weiser and nodded. "Did it work?" "Not this time around, but I think I had thing work in other. Only I can't be sure because most of the dreams I have seem to fade away almost as soon as I wake up." "That's the case with everyone," Weiser said. "The brain treats most dreams as disposable matter, storing them in extreme short-term memory." "You know a lot about this, don't you?" "Interests me very much. I did 2 research papers on the link between dreams and sleep when I was in college." Weiser glanced at his watch. "It's my break time. Would you like to have a cup of coffee and a piece of apple pie with me? There's a place just 2 doors down. The pie is fantastic." "Sounds good, but maybe I'll settle for an orange soda. I've been trying to cut down on my coffee intake." "Understandable, but completely useless," Weiser said cheerfully. "Caffeine is not your problem, Ralph." "No, I suppose not, but what is?" To this point, Ralph had been quite successful at keeping the misery out of his voice, but now it crept back in. Weiser clapped him on the shoulder and looked at him kindly. "And that," he said, "is what we're going to talk about. Come on." Chapter 5. "Think of it this way," Weiser witnessed 5 minutes later. They were in a new, agey sort of diner called Daybreak Sundown. The place was a little too funny for Ralph, who believed in old-fashioned diners that gleamed with chrome and smelled of grease. But the pie was good, and while the coffee was not up to Lois Chase's standards, Lois made the best cup he had ever tasted. It was hot and strong. "What is that?" Ralph asked. "There are certain things mankind, womankind too, striving for. Not the stuff that gets written up in the history and civics books, at least for the most part. I'm talking fundamentals here. A roof to keep the rain out, 3 hots and a cot, a decent sex life, health battles. But maybe the most fundamental thing of all is what you've been missing, my friend. Because there's really nothing in the world that can measure up to a good night's sleep, is there?" "Boy, you got that right," Ralph said. Weiser nodded. "Sleep is the overlooked hero and the poor man's physician. Shakespeare said it's the thread that knits up the raveled sleeve of care. Napoleon called it the blessed end of night, and Winston Churchill, one of the great insomniacs of the 20th century, said it was the only relief he ever got from his depressions. I put all that stuff in my papers, but what all the quotes come down to is what I just said. Nothing in the whole wide world can measure up to a good night's sleep." "You've had the problem yourself, haven't you?" Ralph asked suddenly. "Is that why you're taking your wing?" Joe Weiser grinned. "Is that what I'm doing?" "I think so, yes." "Hey, I can live with that. The answer is yes. I've suffered from slow sleep insomnia ever since I was 13. So I ended up doing not just one research paper on this subject, but two. How are we going and doing with it these days? Weiser shrugged. So far, it's been a pretty good year. Not the best, but I'll take it. For a couple of years in my early 20s, the problem was acute. I'd go to bed at 10, fall asleep around 4, get up at 7, and drag myself through the day feeling like a bit Claire in someone else's nightmare. This was so familiar to Ralph that his back and upper arms broke out in goosebumps. Here comes the most important thing I can tell you, Ralph, so listen up. I am. The thing you have to hang on to is that you're still basically okay, even though you feel like shit a lot of the time. All sleep is not created equal, you see. There's good sleep and bad sleep. If you're still having coherent dreams, and maybe even more important, lucid dreams, you're still having good sleep, and because of that, a script for sleeping pills could be about the worst thing in the world for you right now. And I know Litchfield. He's a nice enough guy, but he loves a prescription pad. Say it twice, Ralph told him, thinking of Carolyn. You tell Litchfield what you told me while we were walking down here. He's going to prescribe benzodiazepine. Probably Dalmune or Restoril. Maybe Halcyon or even Valium. You'll sleep but pay a price. Benzodiazepines are habit-forming. They're respiratory depressants, and worst of all, for guys like you and me, they significantly reduce REM sleep, dreaming sleep in other words. How's your pie? I only asked because you've hardly touched it. Ralph took a big bite and swallowed it without tasting. Good, he said. Now tell me, why you have to have dreams to make sure your sleep is good? If I could answer that, I'd retire from the pill-pushing business and go into the business of being a sleep guru. Weiser finished his pie and was now using the pad with his index finger to pick up the larger crumbs left on his plate. REM stands for rapid eye movement, of course, and the terms REM sleep and dreaming sleep have become synonymous in the public mind. But nobody really knows just how the eye movements of sleepers relate to the dreams they are having. It seems unlikely that the eye movements indicate watching or tracking because sleep researchers see a lot of it even in dreams. In dreams, test subjects later described as fairly static, dreams of conversations, for instance, like the one we're having now. Similarly, no one really knows why there seems to be a clear relationship between lucid coherent dreams and overall mental health. The more dreams of that sort a person has, the better off he seems to be. The less he has, the worse. There's a real scale there. Mental health's a pretty general phrase, Ralph said skeptically. Yeah, Weiser grinned. It makes me think of a bumper sticker I saw a few years back. Support mental health or I'll kill you. Anyway, we're talking about some basic measurable components. Cognitive ability, problem-solving ability, by both inductive and deductive methods, ability to grasp relationships, memory. My memory is lousy these days, Ralph said. He was thinking of his inability to remember the number of the cinema complex and his long hunt through the kitchen cabinet for the last cup of soup envelope. Yeah, you're probably suffering some sort of short-term memory loss. Your fly is zipped, your shirt is on right side out, and I bet if I asked you what your middle name is, you could tell me. I'm not belittling your problem. I'd be the last person in the world to do that, but I am asking you to change your point of view for a minute or two, to think of all the areas in your life where you're still perfectly functional. Alright, these lucid and coherent dreams, do they just indicate how well you're functioning like a gas gauge in a car, or do they actually help you function? No one knows for sure, but the most likely answer is a little of both. In the late 50s, around the time that the doctors were phasing out the barbiturates, the last really popular one was a fun drug called thalidomide. A few scientists even tried to suggest that the good sleep we've been beating our gums about is related. And the tests don't support the hypothesis. To stop dreaming or some constant dream interruptions have all sorts of problems, including cognitive ability and stability. They also start to suffer perceptual problems like hyperreactivity. Beyond Wiser at the far end of the counter sat a fellow reading a copy of the Daily News. Only his hands and the top of his head were visible. He was wearing a rather ostentatious pinky ring on his left hand. The headline at the top of the front page read, "Abortion Rights Advocate Agrees to Speak in Derry Next Month." Below it, in slightly smaller letters, was a pro-life group's promise organized protests. In the center of the page was a color picture of Susan Day, one that did her much more justice than the flat photographs on the poster he had seen in the window of second-hand clothes. In those, she had looked ordinary, perhaps even a bit sinister. In this one, she was radiant. Her long, honey-blonde hair had been pulled back from her face. Her eyes were dark, intelligent, arresting. Hamilton Davenport's pessimism had been misplaced, it seemed. Susan Day was coming after all. Then Ralph saw something which made him forget all about Ham Davenport and Susan Day. A gray-blue aura had begun to gather around the hands of the man reading the newspaper, and around the just visible crown of his head. It seemed particularly bright around the onyx pinky ring he wore. It did not obscure, but seemed to clarify, turning the rhinestone into something that looked like an asteroid in a really realistic science fiction movie. What did you say, Ralph? Ralph drew his gaze away from the newspaper reader's pinky ring with an effort. I don't know. Was I talking? I guess I asked you what hyperreality is. Heightened sensory awareness, I said. Like taking an LSD trip without having to ingest any chemicals. Ralph said, watching as the bright gray-blue aura began to form complicated runic patterns on the nail of the finger Wiser was using to mash up crumbs. At first they looked like letters, then sentences written in fog, then odd, gasping faces. He blinked and they were gone. Ralph, you still there? Sure you bet. But listen, Joe, if the folk remedies don't work and the stuff in aisle 3 doesn't work and the prescription drugs could actually make things worse instead of better, what's that lead? Nothing, right? You going to eat the rest of that? Wiser said, pointing at Ralph's plate. Chilly gray light drifted off the tip of his finger like Arabic letters written in dry ice vapor. Nope, I'm full. Be my guest. Wiser pulled Ralph's plate to him. Don't give up so fast, he said. I want you to come back to the farm with me so I can give you a couple business cards. My advice is for any neighborhood drug pusher is that you give these guys a try. What guys? Ralph asked, watching, fascinated, as Wiser opened his mouth to receive the last bite of pie. Each of his teeth was lit with a fierce gray glow. The fins in his molars glowed like tiny suns. The fragments of crust and apple filling his tongue crawled with lucid, Ralph, lucid. Light. Wiser closed his mouth to chew and the glow was gone. James Roy Hong and Anthony Forbes. Hong is an acupuncturist with offices in Kansas Street. Forbes is a hypnotist with a place over on the east side. Hesser Street, I think. And before you yell quack, I'm not going to yell quack, I said quietly. His hand rose to touch the magic eye, which was still wearing under his shirt. Believe me, I'm not. Okay, good. My advice is that you try Hong first. The needles look scary, but they only hurt a little. And he's got something going there. I don't know what the hell it is or how it works, but I do know that when I went through a bad patch 2 winters ago, he helped me a lot. Forbes is also good, so I've heard, but Hong my pick. He's busy as hell, but I might be able to help you there. What do you say? Ralph saw a bright gray glow, no thicker than a thread, slip from the corner of Wiser's eye and slid down his cheek like a supernatural tear. It decided him. I say let's go. Weiser clapped him on the shoulder. Good man. Let's pay up and get out of here. He produced a quarter. Flip for the check. 2. Halfway back to the pharmacy, Weiser stopped to look at a poster, which had been put in the window of an empty storefront between Rite Aid and the diner. Ralph only glanced at it. He had seen it before in the window of second-hand Rose, second-hand clothes. Wanted for murder, Weiser marveled. People have lost all goddamn sense of perspective. Do you know it? Yes, Ralph said. If we had tells, I think most of us would spend all day chasing them, trying to bite them off. The poster's bad enough, Weiser said indignantly, but look at this. He was pointing at something beside the poster, something which had been written in the dirt which coated the outside of the empty display window. Ralph leaned close to read the short message. Kill this cunt, it said. Below the words was an arrow pointing at the left-hand photo of Susan Day. Jesus, Ralph said quietly. Yeah, Weiser agreed. He pulled a handkerchief from his back pocket and wiped away the message, leaving in place of the words a bright, silvery fan shape, which Ralph knew only he could see. 3. He followed Weiser to the rear of the pharmacy and stood in the doorway of an office not much bigger than the public toilet cubicle, while Weiser sat on the only piece of furniture, a high stool that would have looked at home in Ebenezer Scrooge's counting house, and phoned the office of James Roy Hong, acupuncturist. Weiser pushed the phone's speaker button so Ralph could follow the conversation. Hong's reception, someone named Audra, who seemed to know Weiser on a basis a good deal more than a merely professional one, at first said Dr. Hong could not possibly see a new patient until after Thanksgiving. Ralph's shoulders slumped. Weiser raised an open palm in his direction. Wait a minute, Ralph. And then proceeded to talk Audra into finding or perhaps creating an opening for Ralph in early October. That was almost a month away, but a lot better than Thanksgiving. Thanks, Audra, Weiser said. We still on for dinner tonight? Yes, she said. Now turn off the damn speaker, Joe. I have something that's for your ears only. Weiser did it, listened, laughed until tears. To Ralph they looked like gorgeous liquid pearls, stood in his eyes. Then he smooched twice into the phone and hung up. He said, handing Ralph a small white card with the time and date of the appointment written on the back. October 4th. Not great, but really the best you could do. Audra's good people. It's fine. Here's Anthony Forbes' card in case you want to call him in the interim. Thanks, Ralph said, taking the second card. I owe you. The only thing you owe me is a return visit so I can find out how it went. I'm concerned. There are doctors who won't prescribe anything for insomnia, you know. I'd like to say that no one ever died from lack of sleep, but I'm here to tell you that's crap. Ralph supposed this news should have frightened him, but he felt pretty steady, at least for the time being. The auras had gone away, and bright gleams in Weiser's eyes as he laughed at whatever Hong's receptionist had said to him. He was starting to think that they just had been a mental fugue brought on by a combination of extreme tiredness and Weiser's mental hyper-reality. There was another reason for feeling good. He now had an appointment with a man who had helped this man through a similar bad patch. Ralph thought he'd let Hong stick needles into him until he looked like a porcupine, if the treatment allowed him to sleep until the sun came up. And there was a third thing. The gray auras hadn't actually been scary. They had been sort of interesting. People die from lack of sleep all the time, Weiser was saying. Although the medical examiner usually is writing suicide or cause of death line rather than insomnia. Insomnia and alcoholism have a lot in common, but the major thing is this. They're both diseases of the heart and mind, and when they're allowed to run their course, they usually gut the spirit long before they're able to destroy the body. So yeah, people do die from lack of sleep. This is a dangerous time for you, and you have to take care of yourself. If you start to feel really wonky, call Litchfield. Do you hear me? Don't stand on ceremony. Ralph grimaced. I think I'd be more apt to call you. Weiser nodded as if he had absolutely expected this. "The number under Hong's is mine," he said. Surprised, Ralph looked down at the card again. There was a second number there, marked JW. "Dare I?" Weiser said. "Really, you won't disturb my wife. We've been divorced since 1983. Ralph tried to speak and found he couldn't. All that came out was a choked, meaningless little sound. He swallowed hard, trying to clear the obstruction in his throat. Weiser saw he was struggling and clapped him on the back. "No bawling in the store, Ralph. It scares away the big spinners. You want a Kleenex?" "No, I'm okay." His voice was slightly watery, but audible, mostly under control. Weiser cast a critical eye on him. "Not yet, but you will be." Weiser's big hand swallowed Ralph's once more, and this time Ralph didn't worry about it. For the time being, try to relax and remember to be grateful for the sleep you do get. "Okay, well, thanks again." Weiser nodded and walked back to the prescription counter. Section 4. Ralph walked back down the aisle, turned left at the formidable condom display, and went out through a door with "Thank you for shopping at Rite Aid" decaled above the push bar. At first he thought there was nothing unusual about the fierce brightness that made him squint his eyes almost shut. It was midday after all, and perhaps the drugstore had been a little darker than he had realized. Then he opened his eyes wide again, and his breath came to a dead stop in his throat. The look of thunderstruck amazement spread over his face. It was the expression of an explorer that an explorer might wear when, after pushing his way through just one more nondescript tangle of bushes, he finds himself looking at some fabulous lost city or brain-busting geological feature. A cliff of diamonds, perhaps, or a spiral waterfall. Ralph shrank back against the blue mailbox, standing to one side of the drugstore's entrance, still not breathing, his eyes shuttling jerkily from left to right as the brain behind them tried to understand the wonderful and terrible news it was receiving. The orders were back, but it was a little like saying Hawaii was a place where you didn't have to wear your overcoat. This time the light was everywhere, fierce and flowing, strange and beautiful. Ralph had had only one experience in his entire life, which was remotely similar to this. During the summer of 1941, the year he turned 18, he'd been riding his thumb from Derry to his uncle's place in Poughkeepsie, a distance of about 400 miles. An early evening thunderstorm at the end of his second day on the road had sent him scurrying to the nearest available shelter, a decrepit barn swaying drunkenly at the end of a long hayfield. He had spent more of that day walking than riding, and had fallen soundly asleep in one of the barn's long-abandoned horse stalls, even before the thunder had stopped blasting the sky overhead. He'd awakened at mid-morning the next day after a solid 14 hours of sleep, and had looked around in utter wonder, not even sure, in those first few moments, where he was. He only knew it was some dark, sweet-smelling place, and that the world above, on all sides of him, had been split open with brilliant seams of light. Then he had remembered taking shelter in the barn, and it came to him that the strange vision had been caused by the cracks in the barn's walls and roof combined with the bright summer sunlight. Only that, and nothing more. Yet he'd sat there in mute wonder for at least 5 minutes, just listening, a wide-eyed teenage boy with hay in his hair and his arms dusted with chaff. He sat there looking up at the tidal gold of dust motes, spinning lazily in the slanting, cross-hatched rays of the sun. I remember thinking it had been like being in church. This was that experience to the 10th power, and the hell of it was simply this. He could not describe exactly what had happened and how the world had changed, but to make it so wonderful. Things and people, particularly the people, had auras, yes, but that was only where his amazement of phenomenon began. Things had never been so brilliant, so utterly and completely there. The cars, the telephone poles, the shopping carts, and the cart in front of the supermarket, the different apartment building across the street, all these things seemed to pop out at him like 3D images in an old film. All at once, this dingy little strip mall on Witcham Street had become Wonderland, and although Ralph was looking at it, he was not sure what he was looking at, only that it was rich gorgeous and fabulously strange. The only things he could isolate were the auras surrounding the people going in and out of stores, storing packages in their trunks or getting in their cars and driving away. Some of these auras were brighter than others, but even the ones were 100 times brighter than his first glimpses of the phenomenon. But it's what Weiser was talking about, no doubt of that. It's hyper-reality, and what you're looking at is no more there than the hallucinations of people who are under the influence of LSD. What you're seeing is just another symptom of your insomnia. No more, no less. Look at it, Ralph, and marvel over it as much as you want. It is marvelous. Just don't believe it. He didn't need to tell himself to marvel, however. There were marvels everywhere. A bakery truck was backing out of a slot in front of Daybreak Sundown in a bright maroon substance. It was almost the color of dried blood. Came from its tailpipe. It was neither smoke nor vapor, but had some of the characteristics of each. The brightness of rose gradually attenuating spikes like the lines an EEG readout. Ralph looked down at the pavement and saw the tread of the van's tires printed on the concrete in that same maroon shade. The van speeded up as it left the parking lot, and the ghostly graph trail emerging with its exhaust turned the bright red arterial blood as it did. There were similar oddities everywhere, a phenomenon which intersected in slanting paths and made Ralph think again of how the light had come slanting through the cracks in the roof and walls of the long-ago barn. But the real wonder was the people, and it was around them that the aura seemed most clearly defined and real. The bag boy came out of the supermarket, pushing a cartload of groceries and walking in a nimbus of brilliant white that it was like a traveling spotlight. The aura of the woman beside him was dingy by comparison, the gray green of cheese, which has begun to mold. A young girl called to the bag boy from the open window of a Subaru and waved. Her left hand left bright contrails, as pink as cotton candy, in the air as it moved. They began to fade almost as soon as they appeared. The bag boy grinned and waved back. His hand left a fantail of yellowish white behind. To Ralph it looked like the fin of a tropical fish. This also began to fade, but more slowly. Ralph's fear at this confused, shining vision was considerable, but for the time being, at least, there had taken a back seat to wonder, awe, and simple amazement. It was more beautiful than anything he had ever seen in his life, but it's not real, he cautioned himself. Remember that, Ralph. He promised himself he would try, but for the time being, that cautioning voice seemed very far away. Now he noticed something else. There was a line of that lucid brightness emerging from the head of every person he could see. It trailed upward like a ribbon of bunting or brightly colored crepe paper until it attenuated and disappeared. For some people, the point of disappearance was 5 feet above the head. For others, it was 10 or 15. In most cases, the color of the bright, ascending line matched the rest of the aura. Bright white for the bag boy, gray-green in the case of the female customer beside him, for instance, but there were some striking exceptions. Ralph saw a rust-red line rising from the middle-aged man who was striding along in the middle of the dark blue aura, and a woman with a light gray aura whose ascending line was an amazing and slightly alarming shade of magenta. In some cases, 2 or 3, not a lot, the rising lines were almost black. Ralph didn't like those, and he noticed that the people to whom these balloon streams they named just that simply and quickly in his mind belonged invariably and looked unwell. Of course they do. Balloon strings are an indicator of health, and ill health in some cases, like the curling auras people were so fascinated with back in the late 60s and early 70s. Ralph, another voice warned, you're not really seeing these things, okay? I mean, I hate to be a bore, but wasn't it at least possible that the phenomenon was real? That his persistent insomnia, coupled with the stabilizing influence of his most coherent dreams, had afforded him a glimpse of a fabulous dimension just beyond the reach of ordinary perception? Quit it, Ralph, and right now. You have to do better than that, or you'll end up in the same boat as poor old Ed dipping you. Thinking of Ed kicked off some association. Something he'd said on that day he'd been arrested for beating his wife. But Ralph could isolate it. A voice spoke almost at his left elbow. Mom? Mommy? Can we get the Honey Nut Cheerios again? We'll see once we get inside him. The young woman and the little boy passed in front of him, walking hand in hand. It was the boy who looked to be 4 or 5 who had spoken. His mother was walking in an envelope of almost blinding white. The balloon string rising out of her blonde hair was also white and very wide. More like a ribbon or ribbons on a fancy gift box than a string. It rose to the height of at least 20 feet and floated out slightly behind her as she walked. It made Ralph think of things: bridal trains, veils, gauzy billows of skirt. Her son's aura was a healthy dark blue virgin on violet, and as the two of them walked past, Ralph saw a fascinating thing. Tendrils of aura were also rising from their clasped hands, white from the woman, dark blue from the boy. They twined in a pigtail as they rose, faded, and disappeared. Mother and son, Ralph thought. There was something perfectly, simply symbolic about those hands. And the bands, which were wrapping around each other like wood climbing up a garden stake. Looking at them made his heart rejoice. Corny, but it was exactly how he felt. Mother and son, white and blue, mother and... Man, what's the man looking at? The blonde woman's glance at Ralph was brief, but he saw the way her lips thinned down and pressed together before she turned away. More important, he saw the brilliant aura which surrounded her suddenly darken, close in, and pick up spiraling tints of dark red. That's the color of fright, Ralph thought, or maybe anger? No, Tim, come on, stop dawdling. She began to move him a little faster, held hair flipping back and forth and leaving small fans of gray tinged with red in the air. To Ralph, they looked like the arcs that wipers sometimes left on dirty windshields. Hey, Mom, get a life. Quit pulling. The boy had to trot in order to keep up. That's my fault, Ralph thought. An image of how he must have looked to the young mother flashed into his mind. Old guy, tired face, big purplish pouches under his eyes. He's standing hunching by the mailbox outside the Rite Aid pharmacy, staring at her and her little boy as if they were the most remarkable things in the world. What you just about are, ma'am, if you but knew it. To her, he must have looked like the biggest pervo of all time. He had to get rid of this, real or hallucination, it didn't matter. He had to make it quick. If he didn't, somebody was going to call either the mother, the cops, or the men with the butterfly nets. For all he knew, the pretty mother could be making the bank of payphones just inside the market's main doors, her first stop. He was just asking himself how one thought away something which was all in one's mind to begin with when he realized it had already happened. Psychic phenomenon, or sensory hallucination. It had simply disappeared while he'd been thinking about how awful he must have looked to the pretty young mother. The day had gone back to its previous Indian summery brilliance, which was wonderful but still a long way from the pellucid, all-pervading glow. The people crisscrossing the parking lot of the strip mall were just people again. No auras, no balloon strings, no fireworks. Just people on their way to buy groceries in the shop and save, or to pick up their last batch of summer pictures at Photomat, or to grab a takeout coffee from daybreak sundown. Some of them might even be ducking into the Rite Aid for a box of Trojans or God bless us and keep us asleep again. Just your ordinary everyday citizens of Derry, going about their ordinary everyday business. Ralph released pent-up breath and a gusty sigh and braced himself for a wave of relief. Relief did come, but not in the tidal wave he had expected. There was no sense of having drawn back from the brink of madness in the nick of time, no sense of having been close to any sort of brink. Yet he understood perfectly well that he couldn't live for long in a world that bright and wonderful without endangering his insanity. It would be like having an orgasm which lasted for hours. That might be how geniuses and great artists experience things, but it was not for him. So much juice would blow his fuses in short order. And when the men with the butterfly nets rolled up to give him a shot and take him away, he would probably be happy to go. The most readily identifiable emotion he was feeling just now wasn't relief, but a species of pleasant melancholy, which he remembered sometimes experiencing after sex, when he was a very young man. This melancholy was not deep, but it was wide, seemed to fill the empty places of his body and mind, the way a receding flood leaves a scrim of loose, rich topsoil. He wondered if he would ever have such an alarming, exhilarating moment of epiphany again. He thought the chances were fairly good, at least until next month, when James Roy Hung got his needles into him, or perhaps until Anthony Forbes started swinging his gold pocket watch in front of his eyes and telling him he was getting very sleepy. It was possible that neither Hung or Forbes would have any success in curing his insomnia. But if one of them did, Ralph guessed he would stop seeing auras and balloon strings after his first good night's sleep. And after a month or so of restful nights, he would probably forget this had ever happened. As far as he was concerned, that was a perfectly good reason to feel a touch of melancholy. You better get moving, buddy. If your new friend happens to look out the drugstore window and see you still standing here like a dope, he'll probably send for the men with the nets himself. Call Dr. Litchfield, make it, Ralph muttered, and cut across the parking lot toward Harris Avenue. He poked his head through Lois's front door and called, "Yo, anybody home?" "Come on in," Ralph was called back. "We're in the living room." Fred always imagined a hobbit hole would be a lot like Lois Chase's little house, half a block or so down the hill from the Red Apple. Neat and crowded, a little too dark, perhaps, but scrupulously clean. And he guessed hobbit like Bilbo Baggins, whose interest in the ancestors was eclipsed only by his interest in what might be for dinner. Would have been enchanted by the tiny living room, where relatives looked down from every wall. The place of honor, on top of the television, was held by a tinted studio photograph of the man Lois always referred to as Mr. Chase. McGovern was sitting hunched forward on the couch with a plate of macaroni and cheese balanced on his bony knees. The television was on and a game show was clattering through the bonus round. "What does she mean, we're in the living room?" Ralph asked, but before McGovern could answer, Lois came in with a steaming plate in her hands. "Here," she said, "sit down, eat. I talked with Simone, and she said it'll probably be on news at noon." "Gee, Lois, you didn't have to do this," he said, taking the plate, but his stomach demurred strongly when he got his first smell of onions and mellow cheddar. He glanced at the clock on the wall, just visible between photos of a man in a raccoon coat and a woman who looked as if voodoo de Odo might have been in her vocabulary, and was astounded to see it was 5 minutes of 12. "I didn't do anything but stick some leftovers into the microwave," she said. "Someday, Ralph, I'll cook for you. Now sit down." "Not on my hat, though," McGovern said, without taking his eyes from the bonus round. He picked up the fedora off the couch, dropped it on the floor beside him, and went back to his own portion of casserole, which was disappearing rapidly. "This is very tasty, Lois." "Thank you." She paused long enough to watch one of the contestants bag a trip to Barbados and a new car, then hurried back into the kitchen. The screaming wind faded out and was replaced by a man in wrinkled pajamas, tossing and turning in bed. He sat up and looked at the clock on the nightstand. It said 3:18 a.m. The time of day with which Ralph had become very familiar. "Can't sleep?" an announcer asked sympathetically. "Tired of lying awake night after night?" A small glowing pill came gliding into the insomniac's bedroom window. To Ralph it looked like the world's smallest fine saucer, and he wasn't surprised to see that it was blue. Ralph sat down beside McGovern. Although both men were quite slim, Scrawny might have described built better. Between them, he used up most of the couch. Lois came in with her own plate and sat down in the rocker by the window. Over the canned music and studio applause that marked the end of the game show, a woman's voice said, "This is Lizette Benson, topping our news at noon. A well-known women's rights advocate agrees to see Mary, sparking a protest, and 6 arrests at a local clinic. We'll also have Chris Altenberg's weather and Bob McClanahan on sports. Stay tuned." Ralph forked a bite of macaroni and cheese into his mouth, looked up and saw Lois watching him. "All right?" she asked. "Delicious," he said, and it was. But he thought that right now, a big helping of Franco-American spaghetti, served cold out of a can, would have tasted just as good. He wasn't just hungry, he was ravenous. Seeing auras apparently burned a lot of calories. "What happened, very briefly, was this," McGovern said, swallowing the last of his own lunch and putting the plate down next to his hat. "About 18 people showed up outside Women Care at 8:30 this morning, while people were arriving for work. Lois's friend Sloan says they're calling themselves Friends of Life. But the quarter are the assorted fruits and nuts that used to go by the name of Daily Bread. She said one of them was Charles Pickering, the guy the cops caught getting ready to fire on the joint late last year. Simone's niece said the police only arrested 4 people. It looks like she was a little low." "Was Ed really with them?" Ralph asked. "Yes," Lois said, "and he got arrested too. At least no one got maced. That was just a rumor. No one got hurt at all." "This time," McGovern added darkly. The News at Noon logo appeared on Lois's Hobbit-sized color TV, then dissolved into Lizette Benson. "Good afternoon," she said, "topping our news on this beautiful late summer day. Prominent writer and controversial women's rights advocate Susan Day agrees to speak at Derry Civic Center next month." And the announcement of her speech sparks a demonstration at Women Care, the Derry Women Resource Center and abortion clinic, which has so polarized. "There they go with that abortion clinic again," McGovern explained. "Jesus." "Hush," she said, in a peremptory tone, not much like her usual tentative murmur. McGovern gave her a surprised look and hushed. John Kirkland at Women Care with the first of 2 reports. Lizette Benson was finishing, and the picture switched to a reporter doing a stand-up outside a long, low-brick building. A supper at the bottom of the screen informed viewers that this was a Live Eye report. A strip of windows ran along one side of Women Care. 2 of them were broken, and several others were smeared with red stuff that looked like blood. Yellow police line tape had been strung between the reporter and the building. 3 uniformed Derry cops and 1 plainclothes man stood in a little group on the far side of it. Ralph was not very surprised to recognize the detective as John Lydecker. They called themselves the Friends of Life, Lizette, and they claimed that their demonstration this morning was a spontaneous outpouring of indignation prompted by the news that Susan Day, a woman radical pro-life group's nationwide call America's #1 killer, is coming to Derry next month to speak at the Civic Center. At least one Derry police officer believes. That's not quite the way it was, however. Kirkland's report went to tape, beginning with a close-up of Lydecker, who soon resigned, the microphone in his face. "There was no spontaneity about this," he said. "Clearly a lot of preparation went into it. They've probably been sitting on advance word of Susan Day's decision to come here and speak for most of the week, just getting ready and waiting for the news to break in the paper, which it did this morning." Camera went to a two-shot. Kirkland was giving Lydecker his most penetrating Geraldo look. What do you mean a lot of preparation, he asked. Most of the signs they were carrying had Miss Day's name on them. Also, there were over a dozen of these. Surprisingly, human emotion slipped through Lydecker's policeman being interviewed mask. Ralph thought it was distaste. He raised a large plastic evidence bag, and for one horrified instant, Ralph was positive that there was a mangled and bloody baby inside. Then he realized that, whatever the red stuff might be, the body in the evidence bag was a doll's body. They didn't buy these at Kmart, Lydecker said to the TV reporter. I guarantee you that. The next shot was a long lens close-up of the smeared and broken windows. The camera panned them slowly. The stuff on the smeared ones looked more like blood than ever, and Ralph decided he didn't want the last 2 or 3 bites of his macaroni and cheese. The demonstrators came with baby dolls, whose soft bodies had been injected with what police believed to be a mixture of Cairo syrup and red food coloring. Kirkland said in a voiceover. They formed dolls at the side of the building as they chanted anti-Susan Day slogans. 2 windows were broken, but there was no major damage. The camera stopped, centering on a gruesomely smeared pane of glass. Most of the dolls split open, Kirkland was saying, splattering a substance that looked enough like blood to badly frighten the employees who witnessed the bombardment. The shot of the red smeared window was replaced by one of a lovely dark-haired woman in slacks and a pullover. Oh, look, it's Barbie, Lois cried. Golly, I hope Simone's watching. Maybe I ought to... It was McGovern's turn to say hush. I was terrified, Richards told Kirtland. First I thought they were really throwing dead babies, or maybe fetuses they'd gotten a hold of somehow. Even after Dr. Harper ran through yelling that they were only dolls, I still wasn't sure. You said they were chanting? Kirkland asked. Yes, what I heard most clearly was, keep the angel of death out of Derry. People now reverted to Kirkland in his live stand-up mode. The demonstrators were ferried from Woman Care to Derry Police Headquarters on Main Street around 9 o'clock this morning, Lizette. I understand that 12 were questioned and released. 6 others were arrested on charges of malicious mischief, a misdemeanor. So it seems that another shot in Derry's continuing war of abortion has been fired. This is John Kirkland, Channel 4 News. Another shot in, McGovern began, and threw up his hands. Lisette Benson was back on the screen. We now go to Ann Rivers, who talked less than an hour ago to 2 of the so-called Friends of Life, who were arrested in this morning's demonstration. Alright, boys and girls, we're going to go to our first music break. On this break, we have Miss Mia Savage with her band Antidote for Savages, and they'll be singing Your Skeleton, Veneering Crypto, Let Me Be Your Home, and All I Need Reality. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this music break. No sound. So the music wasn't playing? Well, it looks like it's playing. Oh, that's weird. Huh. What are you talking about, Willis? I do not know. Anywho. Yeah, that's super weird. Now I'm confused. Welcome back. Thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight on Weird Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. We're doing story time with Host TessaTNT, and we've been reading some Stephen King. Insomnia. Are you still not hearing any sound? Good Lord. Standing on the steps of the main street, Pop shop with Ed Deepnew on one side and a tall, sallow, goatee individual on the other. Ed was looking natty and downright handsome in a gray tweed jacket and navy slacks. The tall man with the goatee was dressed as only a liberal with daydreams of what you might think of as the new proletariat. Whatever that is. Her dress, faded jeans, faded blue work shirt, wide red fire suspenders. It took Ralph only a second to place him. It was Dan Dalton, owner of Secondhand Clothes. Good gosh. What are they going off about? The last time he had been standing behind the hanging guitars and bird cages in his shop window, clapping his hands at Ham Davenport in a gesture that said, "Who gives a shit what you think?" But it was Ed. His eyes were drawn back too, of course. Ed, who looked natty and put together in more ways than one. The governor apparently felt that the same. "My God, I can't believe it's the same man," he murmured. The set, the good one was saying. "With me I have Edward Pugh and Daniel Dalton, both of Derry. Two of those arrested in this morning's demonstration." "That's correct, gentlemen. You were arrested?" They nodded, Ed with a barest twinkle of humor, Dalton with dour, jut-jawed determination. 2 days the latter fixed on Ann Rivers made him look, to Ralph at least, as if he were trying to remember which abortion clinic he had seen her hurrying into, head down and shoulders hunched. "Have you been released on bail?" "We were released on our own recognizance," Ed answered. "The charges were minor. It was not our intention to hurt anyone, and no one was hurt." "We were arrested only because the godless entrenched power structure in this town wants to make an example of us," Dalton said. And Ralph thought he saw a minute wince momentarily tighten Ed's face. "Oh, there he goes again," expression. Ann Rivers swung the mic back to Ed. "The major issue here isn't philosophical. I can't talk, but practical. Although the people who run the women care like the trade on their counseling service, therapy services, free mammograms, and other admirable functions, there's another side to the plan. There's a blood run out of women care. Listen, blood, don't cry." His eyes glowed in his long, lean face, and had discerning insight. All over Eastern Maine, people were jealous and deciding that the man in the red suspenders was crazy, while his partner seemed like a pretty reasonable fellow. It was almost funny. Ed treated Dalton's interjection as the pro-life equivalent of hallelujah, giving it a single full beat before speaking again. "The slaughter at women care has been going on for nearly 8 years now," Ed told her. "Many people, especially radical feminists like Dr. Robert Harper, Women Care's chief administrator, like to gild the lily with phrases like early termination. But what she's talking about is abortion, the ultimate act of abuse against women by a sexist society." "But is lobbying dolls loaded with fake blood against the windows of a private clinic the way to put your views before the public, Mr. Depew?" For a moment, just a moment, there and gone, the twinkle of good humor in Ed's eyes was replaced by a flash of something much harder and colder. For that one moment, Ralph was again looking at the Ed Depew who had been ready to take on a truck driver who outweighed him by 100 pounds. Ralph forgot that what he was watching had been taped an hour ago, and afraid for the slim blonde, who was almost as pretty as the woman to whom our interview subject was still married. Be careful, young lady, Ralph thought. Be careful and be afraid, standing next to a very dangerous man. Then the flash was gone, and the man in the tweed jacket was once more just an earnest young fellow who had followed his conscience to jail. Once more it was Dalton, now nervously snapping his suspenders like big red rubber bands, who looked a few sandwiches shy of a picnic. What we're doing is what the so-called good Germans failed to do in the 30s, Ed was saying. He spoke in the patient, lecturely tones of a man who has been forced to point this out over and over, mostly to those who should already know it. They were silent, and 6 million Jews died, and this came through a similar Holocaust. Over 1,000 babies every day, Dalton said. His former shrillness had departed. He sounded horrified and desperately tired. Many of them ripped from the wombs of their mothers in pieces, with their little arms waving in protest, even as they died. Oh, good God, McGovern said. That's the most ridiculous thing I have ever... Hush, Bill, Lois said. The purpose of this protest, Rivers was asking Dalton. As you probably know, Dalton said, the City Council has agreed to re-examine the zoning regulations that allow women care to operate where it does and how it does. They could vote on the issue as early as November. The abortion rights people are afraid the council might throw censors of their death machine, so they've summoned today this country's most notorious pro-abortion advocate to try and keep the machine running. We're marshaling our forces. Just going to go back over here and make sure there is sound. Is the sound? Yeah, it looks like there is. That's weird. I wonder what's going on with the tube of you. Eventually moved the microphone, swung back to Ed. Will there be more protests, Mr. Depew? Rivers asked, and Ralph suddenly had an idea she might be interested in a way which was not strictly professional. Hey, why not? Ed was a good-looking guy, and Miss Rivers could hardly know that he believed the Crimson King and his centurions were in Derry, joining forces with the baby killers at Women Care. Until the collaboration which opened the door to this slaughter has been corrected, the protests will continue. Ed replied, and we'll go on hoping that the histories of the next century will record that. Not all Americans were good Nazis during this dark period of our history. Violent protests? It's violence we oppose. The two of them were now maintaining strong eye contact, and Ralph thought Ann Rivers had what Carolyn would have called a case of hot thighs. Dan Dalton was standing off to one side of the screen, all forgotten. When Susan Day comes to Derry next month, can you guarantee her safety? Ed smiled in his mind's eye. Ralph saw him as he had been on that hot August afternoon less than a month ago, kneeling with one hand planted on either side of Ralph's shoulders and breathing they burned the fetuses over their Newport into his face. Ralph shivered. In a country where thousands of children are sucked from the wombs of their mothers by the medical equivalent of an industrial vacuum cleaner, I don't believe anyone can guarantee anything, Ed replied. Ann Rivers looked at him uncertainly for a moment, as if deciding whether or not she wanted to ask another question, maybe for his telephone number, and then turned back to face the camera. This is Ann Rivers at Derry Police Headquarters, she said. Lizette Benson reappeared, and something in the bemused cast of her mouth made Ralph think that perhaps he hadn't been the only one to sense the attraction between interviewer and interviewee. We'll be following the story all day, she said. Be sure to tune in at 6 for further updates. In Augusta, Governor Greta Powers responded to charges that she may have. Lois got up and pushed the off button on the TV. She simply stared at the darkened screen for a moment, then sighed heavily and sat down. I have blueberry compote, she said, but after that, do either of you want any? Both men shook their heads. McGovern looked at Ralph and said, That was scary. Ralph nodded. He kept thinking of Ed, and how Ed had gone striding back and forth through the spray thrown by the lawn sprinkler, making rainbows with his body, pounding his fist into his open palm. How could they let him out and yell and then interview him on the news as if he was a normal human being? Lois asked. indignantly. After what he did to poor Helen, my God, that Ann Rivers looked ready to invite him to dinner. We'll eat crackers in bed with her, Ralph said dryly. The assault charge and the stuff today are entirely different matters, McGovern said, and you can bet your the lawyer or yours, his yo-yos have got a retainer, and we'll be sure to keep it that way. And even the assault charge is only a misdemeanor, Ralph reminded her. How can assault be a misdemeanor, Lois asked. I'm sorry, but I never did understand that part. It's a misdemeanor when you do it to your wife, McGovern said, hoisting his satiric eyebrow. It's the American way, Lo. She twisted her hands together restlessly, took Mr. Chase down from the television, looked at him for a moment, then put him back, and resumed twisting her hands. Well, the law's one thing, she said, and I'd be the first to admit it, that I don't understand it at all. Somebody ought to tell him he's crazy, that he's a wife-beater, and he's crazy. You don't know how crazy, Ralph said, and for the first time he told them the story of what had happened the previous summer out by the airport. It took about 10 minutes. When he finished, neither of them said anything. They only looked at him with wide eyes. What? Ralph asked uneasily. You know, you imagined it? Of course I believe it, Lois said. I was just, stunned and frightened. Ralph, I think maybe you ought to on to John Lydecker, McGovern said. I don't think he can do a guiding with it. Adds new playmates. I think it's information he should have. Ralph it over carefully, and then himself. No time, said. Want to come, Lois? Over than I'm tired out, she said. And a little, what do the kids call it these days? A little freaked. I'll put my feet up for a take a You do that, Ralph said. You do look a little tired. And thanks, yes. He bent over her and kissed the corner of her mouth. Lois looked up at him, too. Ralph turned vision a little over 6 hours later, as Benson finished the evening and off to the sports guy. The demonstration at Women Care had been bumped to the number 2 slot. The evening's big story was the allegation that McGovern was cocaine as a grad student, and accept that Dan Dalton identified as head of the Friends of Life. Ralph thought head was probably a better word. Was actually in charge yet? Wasn't. Ralph guessed he would be before long. Christmas at the latest. More interesting question. Employers thought about Ed's legal adventures up the road in Derry. Ralph had an idea less comfortable what had gone on today than once domestic abuse charge. He had read only recently labs would come with such research center in the Northeast working with fetal tissue. They probably would applaud the information that one of their research chemists had been arrested for with fake blood at the that did abortions. And if they knew how crazy he really was, who's going to tell him, Ralph? You? No, that was a step further than he was willing to go, at least for the time being. Unlike going down to the police station with McGovern to talk to John Lydecker about the incident last summer, it felt like persecution, like writing, "Kill this cunt," beside a picture of a woman with whose views you didn't agree. That's bullshit, and you know it. I don't know anything, he said, getting up and going to the window. I'm too tired to know anything. But as he stood there looking across the street at 2 men coming out of the Red Apple with a 6-pack piece, he suddenly did know something. Remembered something that drew a cold line up his back. This morning, when he had come out of Rite Aid and been overwhelmed by the auras and a sense of having stepped up to some new level of awareness, he had reminded himself again and again to enjoy but not believe, that if he failed to mark that crucial distinction, he was apt to end up in the same as Ed Dupuy. That thought had almost opened the door in some associative memory, but the shifting auras in the parking lot had pulled him away from it before it had been able to kick all the way in. Now it came to him. Ed had said something about seeing auras, hadn't he? No, he might have meant auras, but word he actually used was colors. I'm almost positive of that. It was right after he talked about corpses of babies in the place, even on the roof, he said. Ralph watched the two get into the beat-up old van and thought that he would never be able to remember Ed's words exactly. He was just too tired. Then, as the van drove off, trailing a cloud of exhaust that reminded him of the bright maroon stuff he'd seen coming from the tailpipe, the bakery truck that noon, another door opened and the bakery did come. Sometimes the world is full of colors, Ralph told his apartment, but that at some point they all started turning black. I think it was close, but everything? Ralph thought there had at least a little more to Ed's spiel, but he couldn't remember what, and did it matter anyway? His nerve suggested that it did. Line up black had both white and deepened. The telephone rang. Ralph turned and saw it sitting in a bath light, red, the color of nosebleeds and cockfighting cocks. No part of the moan. No, Ralph. Don't get going on this again. Each time the phone rang, the envelope of light got brighter. During the intervals of silence, it darkened. It was like looking at a ghostly heart with a telephone inside it. Each time the phone rang, Ralph closed tightly, and when he opened them again, the red on the telephone was gone. No, you just can't see it right now. I'm not sure, but I think he might have willed away like something in a lucid dream. As he crossed the room to the telephone, he told himself, in no uncertain terms, that that idea was a crazy one, and as crazy as seeing auras in the first place. Except it wasn't, and it wasn't. As if it was crazy, how come it had one rooster red halo of light that made him sure that it was? That's Ralph, Ed, because you're so tired. It's getting fun. Go pick it up, see. Tell. Not even the tell. It's probably some guy wanting to say subscribe. Or the bank wondering, haven't been in. Except he knew better. Ralph picked up the phone and said hello. No answer, but someone was there. Ralph could hear breathing. Hello? He asked. There was still no immediate answer. He was about to say, I'm hanging up now, when Ed Dipnew said, I called about your mouth, Ralph. It's trying to get you in trouble. Between his shoulder blades was no longer a line. Now it was a thin point covering him from the nape of his neck to the small of his back. Hello, Ed. I say, was the only thing he could think of saying. His hand did not seem to be holding the phone so much as to be cramped around it. Never mind that, old boy. Just pay attention. I've had a visit from that wide detective last month. He just left, in fact. Ralph's heart sank, but not as far as he might have feared. After all, Lydecker's going to see Ed wasn't that surprising, was it? He had been very interested in Ralph's story, airport confrontation in the summer of '92. Very interested indeed. Did he? Ralph asked evenly. Detective Lydecker has the idea that I think people, or possibly supernatural beings of some sort, are trucking fetuses out of town in flatbeds and pickup trucks. What a scream, huh? Ralph stood beside the sofa, pulling the telephone cord restlessly through his fingers and realizing that he could see dull red light creeping out of the wire like sweat. The light pulsed with the rhythms of Ed's speech. You've been telling tales out of school, old boy. Ralph was silent. Calling the police after I gave that bitch the lesson she so richly deserved didn't bother me, Ed told him. I put it down to, well, grandfatherly concern, or maybe you thought that if she was grateful enough she might actually spare you a mercy fuck. After all, you're old, but not exactly for Jurassic Park yet. You might have thought she'd let you get a finger into her, at the very least. Ralph said nothing. Right, old boy? Ralph said nothing. You think you're going to rattle me with a silent treatment? Forget it. Ed did sound rattled, thrown off his stride. It was as if he had made a call with a certain script in his head. Ralph was refusing to read his. You can't. You better not. My After you beat Helen didn't upset you, but your conversation with Lydacker, they obviously did. Why is that, Ed? Finally starting to have some questions about your behavior. And maybe? Ed's turn to be silent. At last, he whispered harshly, "You don't take this seriously, Ralph. It'd be the worst." "Oh, I take it seriously," Ralph said. "I saw what you did. I saw what your wife last month did out at the airport a year ago. Now the police. I listened to you, Ed. Now you listen to me. You're ill. You've had some sort of breakdown. You're having delusions. I don't listen to this crap." "No, you don't. It's your dime, after all. But until you do, you keep hammering away because I liked you, Ed, and I want to like you again. You're a bright guy, delusions or no delusions, and I think you can understand me. Lydacker knows, and Lydacker is going to be watching me." "Are you seeing the colors yet?" Ed asked. His voice had become calm again. At the same instant, the red glow on the telephone wire popped out of existence. "What colors?" Ralph asked at last. Ed ignored the question. "You said you liked me. Well, I like you too. I've always liked you. So I'm going to give you valuable advice. You're drifting into deep water, and there are things swimming around and you can't even conceive of. You think I'm crazy, but I want to tell you that you don't know what madness is. You don't have the slightest idea. Although, if you keep on things that don't concern you, take my word for it." "What thing?" Ralph asked. He tried to close the light, but he was still squeezing the telephone receiver tight enough to make his fingers throb. "Forces every place. Our forces at work in Derry you don't want to know about. There are, well, let's just say there are entities. They haven't really noticed. If you keep with me, they will. You don't want that? Well, you don't. Forces? Entities? Ask me how I found out all this stuff. Who brought me into the church? Ralph?" "Yes, we did too." Now, that had been the last thing Ed had said to him before turning on the big screen and going over to greet the cops. "I've seen colors since he came and told me. We'll talk about it. The doctor told me, the little bald doctor. I think it's you'll have to answer to if you try to mind my business again, and then God help you." "The little doctor," Ralph said. "Yes, I see. First the Crimson King and the Syrians, now the little doctor. I suppose it'll be spare me sarcasm, Ralph. Just stay away from me and my interests. Do you hear? Stay away." There was a click and Ed was gone. Ralph held the telephone in his hand for a long time, then slowly hung it up. "Just stay away from me and my interests." Yes, and why not? He looked at his own drive. Ralph walked slowly and stuck a TV dinner, matter of fact, into the oven and tried a boil test or a and Crimson King out of his mind. It was easier than he would have expected. Chapter 6. Summer slipped away as it remained, almost unnoticed. Ralph's premature awakening continued, and by the time the fall colors had begun to burn in the trees along Harris Avenue, he was opening his eye around 2:15 each morning. That was lousy, but he had his appointment with James Roy too, and there had been of the weird fireworks show after his first meeting with Joe Weiser. There were occasional flickers on the edge of things. Ralph squeezed his eyes shut and counted to 5, gone when he opened them again. Well, usually gone. Susan Day's speech was Friday, the 8th of October, and as September drew toward its conclusion, tests in the public abortion on demand debate sharpened and began to focus more and more on her appearance. Ralph saw Ed on the TV news many times, sometimes in the company of Dan Dalton, but more and more frequently on his own, speaking swiftly, cogently, and often with that little gleam of humor not only in his eyes but in his voice. People liked him, and the Friends of Life was apparently attracted. The large membership to which Daily Bread, its political progenitor had only been able to aspire. There were no more doll-throwing parties or excuse me, or other violent demonstrations, but there were plenty of marches and counter-marches, plenty of name-calling and shaking, and angry letters to the editor. Preachers promised damnation, teachers urged moderation and education. Half a dozen young women calling themselves the gay lesbo babes for Jesus were arrested for parading in front of the First Baptist Church of Derry, signs which read, "Get the fuck out of my body." A nameless policeman was quoted in the Derry News as saying that he hopes today would come down with the flu or something and have to cancel her appearance. Ralph received no further communications from Ed, but on September 21st, he received a postcard from Helen with 14 words scrawled across the back. "Hooray, a job! Derry Public Library. I start next month. See you soon, Helen." Feeling more cheered than he had since the night Helen had called him from the hospital, Ralph went downstairs to show the card to McGovern, but the door of the downstairs apartment was shut and locked. Lois then, except that Lois was also gone, probably off to one of her card parties or maybe downtown shopping for yarn and plotting another Afghan. Mildly chagrined and musing on how the people you most wanted to share good news with were hardly ever around when you were all but bursting with it, Ralph wandered down to Strawford Park. It was there that he found Bill McGovern, sitting on a bench near the softball field, crying. Crying was perhaps too strong a word. Leaking might have been better. McGovern sat with the handkerchief sticking out of one gnarled fist, watching a mother and her young son play roll toss along the first baseline of the diamond, where the last big softball event of the season, the intramural city tournament, had concluded just 2 days before. Every now and then, he would raise the fist with a handkerchief in it to his face and wipe at his eyes. Ralph, who had never seen McGovern, not even at Carolyn's funeral, loitered near the playground for a few moments, wondering if he should approach McGovern or just go back the way he had come. At least he gathered up his courage and walked over to the park bench. "Hello, Bill," he said. McGovern looked up with his eyes that were red, watery, and a trifle embarrassed. He wiped them again and tried to smile. "Hi, Ralph. You caught me sniveling. Sorry." "It's okay," Ralph said, sitting down. "I've done my share of it. What's wrong?" McGovern shrugged, then dabbed at his eyes again. "Nothing much. I'm suffering the effects of a paradox, that's all." "What paradox is that?" "Something good is happening to one of my oldest friends. The man who hired me for the first teaching position, in fact. He's dying." Ralph raised his eyebrows, but said nothing. "He's got pneumonia. His niece will probably haul him off to the hospital today or tomorrow, and they'll put him on a ventilator, at least for a while, but he's almost certainly dying. I'll celebrate his death when it comes, and I suppose it's that more than anything else that's depressing the shit out of me." McGovern paused. "You don't understand a thing I'm saying, do you?" "Nope," Ralph said, "but that's all right." McGovern looked into his face, did a double take, then snorted. The sound was harsh and thick with his tears, but Ralph thought it was a real laugh just the same, and risked a small return smile. "Did I say something funny?" "No," McGovern said, and clapped him lightly on the shoulder. "I was just looking at your face, so earnest and sincere. You're really an open book, Ralph. And thinking how much I like you, sometimes I wish I could be you." "Not at 3 a.m, you wouldn't," Ralph said quietly. McGovern sighed and nodded. "The insomnia." "That's right, the insomnia. I'm sorry I laughed, but no apology necessary, Bill. But please believe me when I say it was an admiring laugh." "Who's your friend and what is it a good thing that he's dying?" Ralph asked. He already had a guess as to what lay at the root of McGovern's paradox. It was not quite as good-heartedly dense as Bill sometimes seemed to think. Sorry. Excuse me. His name is Bob Polhurst, and his pneumonia is good news because he's suffered from Alzheimer's since the summer of '88. It was what Ralph had thought, although AIDS had crossed his mind as well. He wondered if that would shock McGovern, and felt a small ripple of amusement at the idea. Then he looked at the man and felt ashamed of his amusement. He knew that when it came to gloom, McGovern was at least a cynic-pro, but didn't believe that made his obvious grief over his old friend any less genuine. Bob was head of the history department at Derry High from 1948, when he couldn't have been more than 25 until 1981 or 82. He was a great teacher, one of those fiercely bright people you sometimes find out in the sticks, hiding their lights under bushels. They usually end up heading their departments and running half a dozen extracurricular activities on the side because they simply don't know how to say no. Bob sure didn't. The mother was now leading her little boy past them and toward the little snack bar that would be closing up for the season very soon now. The kids had an extraordinary translucence, a beauty that was enhanced by the rose-colored aura Ralph saw revolving about his head and moving across his small, lively face in calm waves. "Can I go home, Mommy?" he asked. "I want to use my Play-Doh now. I want to make the clay family." "Alright, let's get something to eat first, big boy, okay? Mommy's hungry." "Okay." There was a hook-shaped scar across the big boy's nose. Near the rosy glow of his aura deepened to scarlet. Fell out of his crib when he was 8 months old, Ralph thought. Reaching for the butterflies on the mobile his mom hung from the ceiling. He scared to death when she ran in and saw the blood. She thought the poor kid was dying. Patrick, that's his name. She calls him Pat. He's named after his grandfather, Ann. He closed his eyes tightly for a moment. His stomach was fluttering lightly just below his Adam's apple, and he was suddenly sure he was going to vomit. "Ralph," McGovern said, "are you all right?" He opened his eyes. No aura, rose-colored or otherwise, just the mother and her son heading over to the snack bar for a cold drink. And there was no way, absolutely no way, he could tell she didn't want to take Pat home because Pat's father was drinking again after almost 6 months on the wagon. And when he drank, he got mean. "Stop it, for God's sake, stop it." "I'm okay, Neil McGovern. Got a speck in my eye, is all. Go on, finish telling me about your friend." "Not much to tell. He was a genius, but over the years I've become convinced that genius is a vastly overrated commodity. I think this country is full of geniuses, guys and gals so bright they make your average card-carrying Mensa member look like Fucko the Clown. And I think that most of them are teachers, living and working in small-town obscurity, because that's the way they like it. It was certainly the way Bob Polhurst liked it. He saw into people in a way that seemed scary to me at first, anyway. After all, you found out you didn't have to be scared, because Bob was kind, but at first he inspired a sense of dread. You sometimes wondered if it was an extraordinary pair of eyes he was using to look at you, or some kind of X-ray machine. At the snack bar, the woman was bending down with a small paper cup of soda. The kid reached up for it with both hands, grinning, and took it. He drank thirstily. The rosy glow pulsed briefly into existence around him again, as he did. And Ralph knew he had been right. The kid's name was Patrick, and his mother didn't want to take him home. There was no way he could know such things, but he did just the same. In those days, McGovern said, if you were from Central Maine and not 100% heterosexual, you tried like hell to pass for it. That was the only choice there was, outside of moving to Greenwich Village and wearing gray and spending Saturday nights in the kind of jazz clubs where they used to applaud by snapping their fingers. But the idea of coming out of the closet was ridiculous. For most of us, the closet was all there was, unless you were a pack of liquored up fraternity boys sitting on you in an alley and trying to pull your face off. The world was your closet. Pat finished his drink and tossed his paper cup on the ground. His mother told him to pick it up and put it in the litter basket, a task he performed with immense good cheer. Then she took his hand and began to walk slowly out of the park. Ralph watched them go with a feeling of trepidation, hoping the woman's fears and worries would turn out to be unjustified, fearing that they wouldn't be. When I applied for a job in the Dairy High History Department, this was in 51. I was fresh from 2 years teaching the sticks, way to hell and gone in Lubbock, and I figured if I could get along up there with no questions being asked, I could get along anywhere. But Bob took one look at me, held inside me, with those x-ray eyes of his, and just knew. And he wasn't shy either. If I decide to offer you this job and you decide to take it, Mr. McGovern, imagine that there will be not so much as an iota of trouble over the matter of your sexual preference. Sexual preference, Ralph? Man, oh man. I'd never even dreamed of such a phrase before that day, but it came sliding out of his mouth, slicker than the ball bearing coated with Crisco. I started to get up on my high horse, tell him I didn't have the slightest idea what he was talking about, but I resented the hell out of it just the same. On general principles, you might say, and then I took another look at him and decided to save my energy. I might have fooled some people in Lubbock, but I wasn't fooling Bob Holhurst. He wasn't 30 himself yet, probably hadn't been south of Kittering more than 10 times in his whole life, but he knew everything that mattered about me, and all it had taken him to find out was one 20-minute interview. No, sir, not an iota, I said, just as meek as Mary's little lamb. McGovern dabbed at his eyes with a handkerchief again, but Ralph had an idea that this time the gesture was mostly theatrical. In the 23 years before I went off to teach at Derry Community College, Bob taught me everything I know about teaching history and playing chess. He was a brilliant player. He certainly would have given the windbag Fay Chapin some hard work to chew on, I could tell you that. I only beat him once, and that was after the Alzheimer's started to take hold. I never played him again after that. And there were other things. He never forgot a joke. He never forgot the birthdays or anniversaries of the people who were close to him. He didn't send cards or gifts, but he always offered congratulations and good wishes, and no one ever doubted his sincerity. He published over 60 articles on teaching history and on the Civil War, which was his specialty. In 1967 and 68, he wrote a book called Later That Summer, about what happened in the months following Gettysburg. He let me read the manuscript 10 years ago, and I think it's the best book on the Civil War I've ever read. The only one that even comes is a novel called The Killer Angels by Michael Shara. Bob wouldn't hear of publishing it, though. When I asked him why, he said that I, of all people, should understand his reasons. Bevan paused briefly, looking out across the park, which was filled with green gold light and black interlacings of shadow, which moved and shifted with each breath of wind. He said he had a fear of exposure. Okay, Ralph said. I get it. Maybe this sums him up best of all. He used to do the big Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle in ink. I poked him about that once, accused him of hubris. He gave me a grin and said, "There's a big difference between pride and optimism, Bill. I'm an optimist, that's all." Anyway, you get the picture. A kind man, a good teacher, a brilliant mind. His specialty was the Civil War, and now he doesn't even know what a Civil War is, let alone who won ours. Hell, he doesn't even know his own name. And at some point soon, the sooner the better actually, he's going to die without any idea that he ever lived. A middle-aged man in a University of Maine t-shirt and ragged blue jeans came shuffling through the playground, carrying a paper shopping bag under one arm. He stopped beside the snack bar to examine the contents of the waste barrel, hoping for a returnable or two. As he bent over, Ralph saw the dark green envelope which surrounded him and the lighter green balloon string which rose, wavering from the crown of his head, and suddenly he was too tired to close his eyes, too tired to push it away. He turned to McGovern and said, "Ever since last month, I've been seeing stuff that—" "I guess in the morning," McGovern said, giving his eyes another theatrical wipe. "Although I don't know if it's for Bob or for me. Isn't that a hoot? But if you could have seen how bright he was in those days, how goddamn scary bright. Bill, see that guy over there by the snack bar? The one reading through the trash barrel? Yeah, those guys are all over the place now," McGovern said, giving the wino, who had found 2 empty Budweiser cans and tucked into his bag, a cursory glance between Ralph. "I hate being old, I guess. Maybe that's all it really comes down to. I mean, big time. The wino approached their bench in a bent knee shuffle, the breeze heralding his arrival with a smell which was not English letter. His aura, a sprightly and energetic green that made Ralph think of St. Patrick's Day decorations, went oddly with his subservient posture and sickly grin. "Say, guys, how you doing?" "We've been better," McGovern said, hoisting the satiric eyebrow, "and I expect we'll be better again once you shove off." The wino looked at McGovern uncertainly, seemed to decide he was a lost cause, and shifted his gaze to Ralph. "You got a bit of spare change, mister? Gotta get to Dexter. My Uncle Tommy out there at the shelter on Nebo Street. Say I can have my old job back at the mill, but only if I get lost, chum," McGovern said. The wino gave him a brief, anxious glance, and then his bloodshot brown eyes rolled back to Ralph again. "That's a good job, you know. I can have it back, but on if you get there today. There's a bus." Ralph reached into his pocket, found a quarter and a dime, and dropped them into the outstretched hand. The wino grinned. The aura surrounding him brightened, then suddenly disappeared. Ralph found that a great relief. All right, boys and girls, we're going to go to our second music break. On this break, we have Miss Mia Savage with her band Antidote for Savages. And she's going to be singing Bury Me in Heaven, Not a Phase, Singing to Your Grave, and The Bottom Line. You guys don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after the break.
now between fear and love. Just a choice right now between fear and love.
Welcome back, and thanks so much for hanging out with me tonight on Paradox Media's Late Night in Rockies. We're doing story time with me, TessaTNT, and we are reading Stephen King's book, Insomnia. I'm going to get back to you at chapter 6. Hey, great, thanks, mister. Don't mention it, Ralph said. The wino lurched off in the direction of the Shop and Save, where such brands as Night Train, Old Duke, and Silver Satin were always on sale. Oh shit, Ralph. Would it hurt you to be a little more charitable in your head as well? He asked himself. Go another half a mile in that direction. You come to the bus station. True, but Ralph had lived long enough to know there was a world of difference between charitable thinking and illusions. If Wino with the dark green aura was going to the bus station, then Ralph was going to Washington to the Secretary of State. You shouldn't do that, Ralph, McGovern said, reprovingly. It just encourages them. I suppose, Ralph said wearily. What were you saying when we were so rudely interrupted? The idea of telling McGovern about the auras now seemed an incredibly bad one, and he could not for the life of him imagine how he had gotten so close to doing it. Insomnia, of course. That was the only answer. It had done a number on his judgment as well as on his short-term memory and sense of perception. But I got something in the mail this morning, Ralph said. I thought it might cheer you up. He passed Helen's postcard over to McGovern, read it, and then reread it. The second time through, his long, horsey face broke into a broad grin. The combination of relief and honest pleasure in that expression made Ralph forgive McGovern his self-indulgent brothers at once. It was easy to forget that Bill could be generous as well as pompous. Say, this is great, isn't it? A job! It sure is. Want to celebrate with some lunch? There's a nice little diner 2 doors down from the Rite Aid. Daybreak Sundown, it's called. Maybe a little ferny, but thanks, but I promised Bob's niece I'd go over and sit with him a while. Of course, he doesn't have the slightest idea who I am, but that doesn't matter, because I know who he is. You capiche? Yep, Ralph said. A rain check then. You got it. McGovern scanned the message on the postcard again, still grinning. "This is the berries. Absolute berries." Ralph laughed at this winsome old expression. "I thought so, too. I would have bet you $5 she was going to walk right back into her marriage to that weirdo and pushing a baby in front of her in its damn stroller. But I would have been glad to lose the money. I suppose that sounds crazy." "A little," Ralph said, but only because he knew it was what McGovern expected to hear. What he really thought was that Bill McGovern had just summed up his own character and worldview more succinctly than Ralph ever could have done himself. "Nice to know someone's getting better instead of worse, huh?" "You bet. Has Lois seen that yet?" Ralph shook his head. "She's not home. I'll show it to her when I see her, though." "You do that. Are you sleeping any better, Ralph?" "I'm doing okay, I guess." "Good. You look a little better, a little stronger." "We can't give in, Ralph. It's that important. It's an important thing. Am I right?" "I guess you are," Ralph said and sighed. "I guess you are, at that." 2 days later, Ralph sat at his kitchen table, slowly eating a bowl of bran flakes he didn't really want, but supposed in some vague way to be good for him, and looking at the front page of Dairy News. He'd skimmed the lead story quickly, but it was the photo that kept drawing his eye back. It seemed to express all the bad feelings he had been living with over the last month without really explaining any of them. Ralph read the headline over the photograph. "Women care demonstration sparks violence," didn't reflect the story which followed, but that didn't surprise him. He'd been reading the news for years and had gotten used to his biases, which included a firm anti-abortion stance. So the paper had been careful to distance itself from the friends of life in that day's tut-tut. "Now a boys, just stop it" editorial, and Ralph was surprised. The friends had gathered in the parking lot adjacent to both Women Care and Dairy Home Hospital, waiting for a group of about 200 pro-choice marchers who were walking across town from the Civic Center. Most of them are carrying signs with pictures of Susan Day and the slogan, "Choice, not fear," on them. The marchers' idea was to gather supporters as they went, like a snowball rolling downhill. At Women Care, there would be a short rally intended to pump people up for the coming Susan Day speech, followed by refreshments. The rally never happened. As the pro-choice marchers approached the parking lot, the Friends of Life people rushed out and blocked the road, holding their own signs. "Murder is murder. Susan Day, stay away. Stop the slaughter of the innocents," in front of them like shields. The marchers had been escorted by police, but no one had been prepared for the speed with which the heckling and angry words escalated into kicks and punches. It had begun with one of the Friends of Life recognizing her own daughter among the pro-choice people. The older woman had dropped her sign and charged the younger. The daughter's boyfriend had caught the older woman and tried to restrain her. When Mom opened his face with her fingernails, the young man had thrown her to the ground. That had ignited a 10-minute melee and provoked more than 30 arrests, split roughly half and half between the two groups. The picture on the front page of this morning's news featured Hamilton, Davenport, and Dan Dalton. The photographer had caught Davenport in a snarl, which was entirely unlike his usual look of calm self-satisfaction. One fist was raised over his head in a primitive gesture of triumph. Facing him and wearing Ham's "Choice, not fear" sign around the top of his head like a surreal cardboard halo was the Friends of Life's grand fromage. Dalton's eyes were dazed, his mouth slack. The high-contrast black and white photo made the blood flowing from his nostrils look like chocolate sauce. Ralph would look away from this for a while, try to concentrate on finishing his cereal, and then he would remember the day last summer when he had first seen one of the pseudo-wanted posters that were now pasted up all over Derry. The day he had nearly fainted outside Strawford Park. Mostly it was their faces his mind fixed on. Davenport's full of angry intensity as he peered into the dusty show window of second-hand rose, second-hand clothes. Dalton's wearing a small, disdainful smile that seemed to suggest that an ape like Hamilton Davenport could not be expected to understand the higher morality of the abortion issue, and they both knew it. Ralph would think of those two expressions and the distance between the men who wore them. After a while, his dismayed eyes would wander back to the news photo. The two men close behind Dalton, both carrying pro-life signs and watching the confrontation intently. Ralph didn't recognize the skinny man with the frontation, horn-rimmed glasses, and the cloud of receding gray hair, but he knew the man beside him. It was Ed DePune. But in this context, Ed seemed almost not to matter. What drew Ralph and frightened him were the faces of the two men who had done business next door to each other on Lower Witcham Street for years. Davenport with his caveman snarl and clenched fist, Dalton with his dazed eyes and bloody nose. He thought, if you're not careful with your passions, this is where they get you. This is where things had better stop because if those two had had guns, they'd have shot each other. He muttered, and at that moment the doorbell rang. The wind down on the front porch. Ralph got up, looked at the picture again, and felt a kind of vertigo sweep through him. With it came an odd, dismal surety. There was Ed down there, and God knew what he might want. Romance written, Ralph. He stood by the kitchen table for a long, undecided moment, wishing bitterly that he could cut through the fog that seemed to have taken permanent residence in his head this year. Then the doorbell chimed again, and he found he had decided. It didn't matter if that was Saddam Hussein down there. This was his place, and he wasn't going to cower in it like a whipped cur. Ralph crossed the living room, opened the door to the hall, and went down the shadowy front stairs. Halfway down, he relaxed a little. Just double checking my sound really quick. Alright. The top half of the door, which gave on the front porch, was composed of heavy glass panes. It distorted the view, but not so much that Ralph could not see that his two visitors were both women. He guessed at once who one of them must be and hurried the rest of the way down, running one hand lightly over the banister. He threw the door open, and there was Helen DePune with a tote bag. Baby First Aid Station was printed on the side. Thumb over one shoulder and Natalie Pune over the other, her eyes as bright as the eyes of a cartoon mouse. Helen was smiling hopefully and a little nervously. Natalie's face suddenly lit up, and she began to bounce up and down in the papoose carrier Helen was wearing, waving her arms excitedly in Ralph's direction. She remembers me, Ralph thought. How about that? And as he reached out and let one of the waving hands grasp his right index finger, his eyes flooded with tears. Ralph, Helen asked, are you okay? He smiled, nodded, stepped forward, and hugged her. He felt Helen lock her own arms around his neck. For a moment, he was dizzy with the smell of her perfume, mingled with the milky smell of the baby. And then she gave his ear a dazzling smack and let him go. You are okay, aren't you? She asked. There were tears in her eyes, too, but Ralph barely noticed them. He was too busy taking inventory, wanting to make sure that no signs of the beating remained. So far as he could see, none did. She looked flawless. Better right now than in weeks, he said. You are such a sight for sore eyes. You too, Nat. He kissed the small, chubby hand that was still wrapped around his finger, and was not entirely surprised to see the ghostly gray and blue lip print his mouth left behind. It did almost as soon as he had noted it, and he hugged her again, mostly to make sure that she was really there. Dear Ralph, she murmured in his ear. Dear sweet Ralph. He felt a stirring in his groin, apparently brought on by the combination of her light perfume and the gentle puffs her words made against the cup of his ear. Then he remembered another voice in his ear, Ed's voice. Called about your mouth, Ralph. It's trying to get you in trouble. Ralph let her go and held her arm at arm's length, still smiling. You're a sight for sore eyes, Helen. I'll be damned if you're not. You are too. I'd like you to meet a friend of mine. Ralph Roberts, Gretchen Tilbury. Gretchen, Ralph. Ralph turned toward the other woman and took his first look at her as he carefully folded his large, gnarled hand over her slim white one. She was the kind of woman that made a man, even one who had left his 60s behind, want to stand up straight and suck in his gut. She was very tall, perhaps 6 feet, and she was blonde, but that wasn't it. There was something else. Something that was like a smell or a vibration or an aura? Yes, all right, like an aura. She was quite simply a woman you could not look at, could not think about, could not speculate about. Ralph Ralph remembered Helen's telling him that Gretchen's husband had cut her leg open with a knife and left her to bleed to death. He wondered how any man could do such a thing, how any man could touch a creature such as this with anything but awe. Also, a little lust. Once he got beyond the she walks in beauty like night stage, and just by the way, Ralph, this might be a really good time to roll your eyes back into their sockets. Very pleased to meet you, he said, letting go of her hand. Helen told me about how you came to see her in the hospital. Thank you for helping her. Helen was a pleasure to help, Gretchen said, and gave him a dazzling smile. She's the kind of woman that makes it all worthwhile, actually, but I know you already know that. I guess I might at that, Ralph said. Have you got time for a cup of coffee? Please say yes. Gretchen glanced at Helen, who nodded. That would be fine, Helen said, because, well, this isn't entirely a social call, is it? Ralph asked, looking from Helen to Gretchen Tilbury and then back to Helen again. No, Helen said, there's something we need to talk about. As soon as they reached the top of the gloomy front stairs, Natalie began to wriggle impatiently around in the papoose carrier and to talk in that imperious pig Latin that would all too soon be replaced by actual words. Can I hold her? Ralph asked. All right, Helen said. If she cries, I'll take her back, promise. Deal. But the exalted and revered baby didn't cry. As soon as Ralph had hoisted her out of the papoose, she slung an arm compassionately around his neck and cozied her bottom into the crook of his right arm, as if it were her own private easy chair. Wow, Gretchen said. I'm impressed. Big, Natalie said, seizing Ralph's lower lip and pulling it out like a window shade. Gonna wig and do sis. I think she just said something about the Andrews sisters, Ralph said. Helen threw her head back and laughed, her hearty laugh, the one that seemed to come all the way up from her heels. Ralph didn't realize how much he had missed it until he heard it. Natalie let Ralph's lower lip snap back as he led them into the kitchen, the sunniest room of the house at this time of day. He saw Helen looking around curiously as he turned on the bun and realized she hadn't been there for a long time. Too long. She picked up the picture of Carolyn that stood on the kitchen table and looked at it closely, a little smile playing out the corners of her lips. The sun lit the tips of her hair, which had been cropped short, making a kind of corona around her, and Ralph had a sudden... He loved Helen in large part because Carolyn had loved her. They had both been allowed into the deeper ranges of Carolyn's heart and mind. Just so pretty, Helen murmured. Wasn't she, Ralph? Yes, he said, putting up and being careful to set them beyond the reach of Natalie's restless interest. That was taken just a month or two before the headache started. I suppose it's eccentric to keep a framed studio portrait on the kitchen table in front of the sugar bowl, but this is the room where I seem to spend most of my time lately, so... I think it's a lovely place for it, Gretchen said. Her voice was low, sweetly husky. Ralph thought, if she'd been the one to whisper in my ear, I bet the old trouser mouse would have done a little more than just turn over in its sleep. I do too, Helen said. She gave him a fragile, quite eye-contact smile, and slipped the pink tote bag off her shoulder and set it on the counter. Natalie began to gabble impatiently and hold her hands out again as soon as she saw the plastic shell of the Playtex nurser. Ralph had a vivid but mercifully brief flash of memory. Helen staggering toward the red apple, one eye puffed shut, her cheek lashed with beads of blood, carrying that on one hip, the way a teenager might carry a textbook. Want to give it a try, old fella? Helen asked. Her smile had strengthened a little, and she was meeting his eye again. Sure, why not? But the coffee. I'll take care of the coffee, Daddy-o, Gretchen said. Made a million cups in my time. Is there half and half? In the fridge. Ralph sat down at the table, letting Natalie rest the back of her head on the hollow of his shoulder, and grasped the bottle with her tiny, fascinating hands. This she did with complete assurance, guiding the nipple into her mouth and beginning to suck at once. Ralph grinned up at Helen and pretended not to see that she had begun to cry a little again. They learn fast, don't they? Yes, she said, and pulled a paper towel off the roll mounted on the wall by the sink. She wiped her eyes with it. I can't get over how easy she is with you, Ralph. She wasn't that way before, was she? I don't really remember, he lied. She hadn't been. Not standoffish, no, but a long way from this comfortable. Keep pushing up on the plastic liner inside the bottle, okay? Otherwise she'll swallow a lot of air and get all gassy. Roger, he glanced over at Gretchen. Doing okay? Fine. How do you take it, Ralph? Just in a cup's fine. She laughed and put the cup on the table out of Natalie's reach. When she sat down and crossed her legs, Ralph checked. He was helpless not to. When he looked again, Gretchen was wearing a small, ironic smile. What the hell? Ralph thought. An old goat like an old goat, I guess. Even an old goat that can't manage much more than 2 or 2.5 hours worth of sleep a night. Tell me about your job, he said as Helen sat down and sipped her coffee. Well, I think they ought to make Mike Hamlin's birthday a national holiday, but... Does that tell you anything? A little, yes, Ralph said, smiling. I was all but positive I'd have to leave Derry. I sent away for applications to libraries as far south as Portsmouth, but I felt sick doing it. I'm going on 31, and I've only lived here for 6 of those years, but Derry feels like home. I can't explain it, but it's the truth. You don't have to explain it, Helen. I think home's just one of those things that happens to a person, like their complexion or the color of their eyes. Gretchen was nodding. Yes, she said, just like that. Mike called Monday and told me the assistant's position in the children's library had opened up. I could hardly believe it. I mean, I've been walking around all week just pinching myself, haven't I, Gretchen? Well, you've been very happy, Gretchen said, and that's been very good to see. He smiled at Helen, and for Ralph, that smile was a revelation. He suddenly understood that he could look at Gretchen Tilbury all he wanted. It wouldn't make any difference. If the only man in this room had been Tom Cruise, it still wouldn't have made any difference. He wondered if Helen knew, and then scolded himself for his foolishness. Helen was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. When do you start? He asked her. Columbus Day week, she said. The 12th. Afternoons and evenings. The salary's not exactly a king's ransom, but it'll be enough to keep us through the winter no matter how the rest of the situation works out. Isn't it great, Ralph? Yes, he said. Very great. The baby had drunk half the bottle and now showed signs of losing interest. The nipple popped halfway out of her mouth, and a little rill of milk ran down from the corner of her lips, towards her chin. Ralph reached to wipe away, and his fingers left a series of delicate gray blue lines in the air. Baby Natalie snatched at them and laughed as they dissolved in her fist. Ralph's breath caught in his throat. She sees. The baby sees what I see. That's nuts, Ralph. That's nuts, and you know it. Except he knew no such thing. He had just seen it. Had seen Nat try to grab the oral contrails his fingers left behind. Helen asked, Are you right? Sure. He looked up and saw that Helen was now surrounded by a luxurious, ivory-colored aura. It had the satiny look of an expensive slip. The balloon string floating up front was an identical shade of ivory, and as broad as the ribbon on a wedding present. The aura surrounding Gretchen Tilbury was a dark orange shading, to yellow at the edges. Will you be moving back into the house? Helen and Gretchen exchanged another of those glances, but Ralph barely noticed. He didn't need to observe their faces or gestures or body language to read their feelings, he discovered. He only had to look at their auras. The lemony tints at the edges of Gretchen's now darkened, so that the whole was a uniform orange. Helen's, meanwhile, simultaneously pulled in and brightened until it was hard to look at. Helen was afraid to go back. Gretchen knew it, and was infuriated by it. And her own helplessness, Ralph thought, that infuriates her even more. I'm going to stay at Highway a while longer, Helen was saying. Maybe until winter. Nat and I move back into town eventually, I imagine, but the house is going up for sale if someone actually buys it. And with the real estate market the way it is, that looks like a pretty big question mark. The money goes into an escrow account. that account will be divided according to the decree. You know, the divorce decree. Her lower lip was trembling, her aura had grown still tighter. It now fit her body almost like a second skin, and Ralph could see minute red flashes skimming through it. They looked like sparks dancing over an incinerator. He reached out across the table, took her hand, squeezed it. She smiled at him gratefully. "You're telling me two things," he said, "that you're going ahead with the divorce and that you're still scared of him." "He's been regularly battered and abused for the last 2 years of her marriage," Gretchen said. "Of course she's still scared of him." She spoke quietly, calmly, reasonably, but looking at her aura now was like looking through a small insomnia glass window you used to find in the doors of coal furnaces. He looked down at the baby and saw her now surrounded in her own gauzy, brilliant cloud of wedding satin. It was smaller than her mother's, but identical, like her blue eyes and auburn hair. Now, this balloon string rose from the top of her head in a pure white ribbon that floated all the way to the ceiling and then actually coiled there in an ethereal heap beside the light fixture. When a breath of breeze puffed in through the window by the stove, he saw the wide white band bell and ripple. He glanced up and saw Helen's and Gretchen's balloon strings were also rippling. If I could see my own, it would be doing the same thing, he thought. It's real. Whatever that 2 and 2 make 4 part of my mind, I think. The auras are real. They're real, and I'm seeing them. He waited for the inevitable time, but this time none came. "I feel like I'm spending most of my time in an emotional washing machine these days," Helen said. "My mom's mad at me. She's done everything but call me a quitter outright. And sometimes I feel like a quitter, ashamed." "You have nothing to be ashamed of," Ralph said. He glanced up at Natalie's balloon string again, wavering in the breeze. It was beautiful, but he felt no urge to touch it. Some deep instinct told him that might be dangerous for both of them. "I guess I know that," Helen said. "But girls go through a lot of indoctrination. It's like, here's your Barbie, here's your Ken, here's your Hostess play kitchen. Learn well, because when the real stuff comes along, it'll be your job to take care of it. And if any of it gets broken, you'll get the blame." And I think I could have gone down that line with that. I really do. Except no one told me that in some marriages, Ken goes nuts. Does that sound self-indulgent? Well, it's pretty much what happens so far as I can see. Helen laughed. A jagged, bitter, guilty sound. "Don't try to tell my mother that. She refuses to believe Ed ever did anything more than give me a husbandly swat on the fanny once in a while. Just to get me moving in the right direction again if I happen to slip off course. She thinks I imagine the rest. She doesn't come right out and say it, but I hear it in her voice every time we talk on the phone." "I don't think you imagine it," Ralph said. "I saw you, remember? And I was there when you begged me not to call the police." He felt his thigh squeezed beneath the table and looked up, startled. Gretchen Tilbury gave him a very slight nod and another squeeze, this one more emphatic. "Yes," Helen said, "you were there, weren't you?" She smiled a little, which was good, but what was happening to her aura was better. Those tiny red flickers were fading, and the aura itself was spreading out again. No, he thought, not spreading out, loosening, relaxing. Helen got up and came around the table. "Nat spelling out on me. Better let me take care of her." Ralph looked down and saw Nat looking across the room with heavy, fascinated eyes. He followed her gaze and saw the little vase standing on the windowsill beside the sink. He had filled it with fall flowers 2 hours ago, and now a low green mist was sizzling off the stems and surrounding the blooms with a faint misty glow. I'm watching them breathe their last, I thought. Oh my god, I'm never going to pick another flower in my life, I promise. Helen took the baby gently from his arms. Nat went tractably enough, although her eyes never left the sizzling flowers as her mother went back around the table, sat down, and nestled her in the crook of her arm. Gretchen tapped the face of her watch lightly. "If we're going to make that meeting at noon..." "Yes, of course," said Helen apologetically. "We're on the official Susan Day Welcoming Committee," she told Ralph, "and in this case, that's not quite as junior league as it sounds. Our main job really isn't to welcome her, but to help protect her. Is that going to be a problem, do you think?" That'll be tense. Let's put it that way, Gretchen said. She's got half a dozen of her own security people, and they've been sending us turnaround faxes of all the dairy-related threats she's received. It's standard operating procedure with them. She's been in a lot of people's faces for a lot of years. They're keeping us in the picture, but they're also making sure we understand that because we're the inviting group. Her safety is Woman Care's responsibility as well as theirs. Ralph opened his mouth to ask if there had been any threats, but he supposed he already knew the answer to that question. He lived in Derry for 70 years off and on, and he knew it was a dangerous machine. There were a lot of sharp points and cutting edges just below the surface. That was true of a lot of cities, of course, but in Derry, there had always seemed to be an extra dimension to the ugliness. Helen had called it home, and it was his home too, but he found himself remembering something which had happened almost 10 years ago. Shortly after the annual Canal Days festival had ended, 3 boys had thrown an unassuming and inoffensive young gay man named Adrian Mellon into the Kenduskeag after repeatedly biting and stabbing him. It was rumored that they stood there on the bridge behind the Falcon Tavern and watched him die. They told the police they hadn't liked the hat he was wearing. That was also Derry, and only a fool would ignore the fact. As if this memory had led him to it, perhaps it had, Ralph looked at the photo on the front page of today's paper again. Cam Davenport with his upper fist, Dan Dalton with his bloody nose and dazed eyes, wearing ham sign on his head. How many threats, he asked. Over a dozen? About 30, Gretchen said. Of those, her security people take half a dozen seriously. There are threats to blow up the Civic Center if she doesn't cancel. One, this is a real honey, is from someone who says he's got a big squirt gun filled with battery acid. So if I make a direct hit, not even your dyke friends will be able to look at you without throwing up, that one says. Nice, Ralph said. It brings us to the point anyway, Gretchen said. She rummaged in her bag, brought out a small can with a red top, and put it on the table, a little present from all your grateful friends at Woman Care. On one side was a picture of a woman spraying a cloud of gas, a man wearing a slouch hat, and a Beagle Boys type eye mask. On the other was a single word in bright red capital letters, bodyguard. What is this? He asked, shocked in spite of himself. Mace? No, Gretchen. Mace is a physician in Maine, really speaking. This stuff is much milder, but if you give somebody a faceful, they won't even think of hassling you for at least a couple of minutes. It numbs the skin, irritates the eyes, and causes nausea. Ralph took the cap off the can, looked at the red aerosol nozzle beneath, then replaced the cap. Christ, woman, why would I want to lug around a can of this stuff? Because you've been officially designated a centurion, Gretchen said. A what? Ralph asked. A centurion, Helen repeated. Nat was fast asleep in her arms, and Ralph realized the horrors were gone again. That's what the Friends of Life call their major enemies, the ringleaders of the opposition. Okay, Ralph said. I've got it now. You talked about people he called centurions on the day he assaulted you. He talked about a lot of things that day, though, and all of them were crazy. Yes, that's at the bottom of it, and he is crazy, Helen said. We don't think he's mentioned the centurion business except to a small inner circle. People who are almost gonzo as he is. The rest of the Friends of Life, I don't think they have any idea. I mean, did you? Until last month, did you have any idea that he was crazy? Ralph shook his head. Talking Labs finally fired him, Helen said. Yesterday they held on to him as long as they could. He's great at what he does, and they had a lot invested in him, but in the end, they had to let him go. 3 months severance pay with notice. Not bad for a guy who beats up his wife and throws dolls loaded with fake blood windows of local women's clinics. She tapped the newspaper. This last demonstration was on straw. It's the 3rd or 4th time he's been arrested since he got involved with the Friends of Life. You have someone inside, don't you? Ralph said. That's how you know all this. Gretchen smiled. We're not the only ones who've got someone at least partway inside. We have a running joke that there really are no friends of life, just a bunch of double agents. Derry PD's got someone. The state police do too. And those are just the ones our person knows about. How the FBI could be monitoring them as well. The friends of life are imminently infiltrable, Ralph, because they're convinced that, deep down, everyone is on their side. But we believe that our person is the only one who's gotten in toward the middle. And this person says that Dan Dalton is just the tail web he wags. I guess that's the first time I saw them together on the TV news, Ralph said. Gretchen got up, gathered the coffee cups, took them over to the sink, and began to rinse them. I've been active in the women's movement for 13 years now, and I've seen a lot of crazy shit, but I've never seen anything like this. He's got those dopes believing that women in Derry are undergoing involuntary abortions, and half of them haven't even realized they're pregnant before the Centurions come in at night and take their babies. Has he told them about the incinerator over in Newport, Ralph asked? The one that's really a baby crematorium? Gretchen turned from the sink, her eyes wide. How did you know about that? Oh, I got the lowdown from Ed himself, up close and in person. Starting in July of '92, he hesitated for just a moment, then gave them an account of the day he had met Ed by the airport and how Ed had accused the man in the pickup of hauling dead babies in the barrels marked weed goat. Helen listened silently, her eyes growing steadily wider and rounder. It was going on about the same stuff on the day he beat you up, Ralph finished, but he'd embellished it considerably by then. That probably explains why he's fixated on you, Gretchen said. In a very real sense, the why doesn't matter. The fact is, he's given this nuttier friend a list of these so-called Centurions. I don't know everyone who's on it, but I am, and Helen is, and Susan Day, of course, and you. Why me? Ralph asked, then recognized it as another pointless question. Maybe Ed had targeted him because he called the cops after Ed had beaten Helen. More likely it happened for no understandable reason at all. Ralph remembered reading somewhere that Dibkowitz, also known as the son of Sam, claimed to have killed on some occasions under instruction from his dog. What do you expect them to try? Ralph asked, armed assault, like in a Chuck Norris movie? He smiled, but Gretchen did not answer it. The thing is, we don't know what they might try, she said. The most likely answer is nothing at all. Then again, Ed or one of the others might take it into his head to try to push you out your own kitchen window. The spray is basically nothing but watered-down tear gas. A little insurance policy, that's all. Insurance, he said thoughtfully. We're in a very select company, Helen said with a wan smile. The only other male Centurion on their list, that we know about anyway, is Mayor Cohen. Did you give him one of these? Ralph asked, picking up the aerosol can. It looked no more dangerous than the free samples of shaving cream we got in the mail from time to time. We didn't need to, Gretchen said. She looked at her watch again. Helen saw the gesture and stood up with the sleeping baby in her arms. He's got a license to carry a concealed weapon. How would you know a thing like that? Ralph asked. We checked the files at City Hall, she said and grinned. Gun permits are a matter of public record. Oh, the thought occurred to him. What about Ed? Did you check on him? Does he have one? Nope, she said, but guys like Ed don't necessarily apply for weapons permits once they get past a certain point. You know that, don't you? Yes, Ralph replied, also getting up. I suppose I do. What about you guys? Are you watching out? You bet, Daddy-O. You bet we are. She wasn't entirely satisfied. There was a faintly patronizing tone in her voice that he didn't like, as if the very question were a silly one. But it wasn't silly, and if she didn't know that, she and her friends could be in trouble down the line. Bad trouble. I hope so, he said. I really do. Can I carry Nat downstairs for you, Helen? Better not, you'd wake her. She said gravely. Would you carry that spray for me, Ralph? I can't stand the thought of you being hurt just because you tried to help me, and he's got some crazy beats on it. I'll think about it very seriously. Will that do? I guess it will. Have to, I guess. She looked at him close, her eyes searching his face. You look much better than the last time I saw you. You're sleeping again, aren't you? He grinned. Well, to tell you the truth, I'm still having problems, but I must be getting better because people keep telling me that. She stood on tiptoe and kissed the corner of his mouth. We'll be in touch, won't we? We'll stay in touch. I'll do my part if you'll do yours, sweetie. She smiled. You can count on that, Ralph. You're the nicest male centurion I know. They all laughed at that, so hard that Natalie woke up and looked around at them in sleepy surprise. After he had seen the woman off, I'm pro-choice and I vote for the sticker on the rib of Gretchen Tilbury's cord fastback. Ralph climbed slowly up the second floor again, weariness dragged at his heels like invisible weights. Once in the kitchen, he looked first at the vase of flowers, trying to see that strange and gorgeous green mist rising from the stems. Nothing. He picked up the aerosol and re-examined the cartoon on the side of the can. One menaced woman heroically warding off her attacker. One bad man, complete with eye mask and slouch hat. No shades of gray here, just a case of going to make my day. It occurred to Ralph that Ed's madness was catching. There were women all over Derry, Gretchen Tilbury and his own sweet Helen, walking around with these little spray cans in their purses. And all the cans really said the same thing. I'm afraid. The bad men in the masks and slouch hats have arrived in Derry, and I'm afraid. Ralph wanted no part of it. Standing on top, he put the can of Bodyguard on top of the kitchen cabinet beside the sink, then shrugged into his old gray leather jacket. He would go up to the pit area near the airport and see if he could find a game of chess. Lacking that, maybe a few rounds of cribbage. He paused in the kitchen doorway, looking fixedly at the flowers, trying to make that sizzling green mist come. Nothing happened. But it was there. You saw it. Natalie did too. But had she? Bagels were always goggling at stuff. Everything amazed them, so how could he know for sure? I just do, he said to an empty apartment. Correct. The green mist rising from the stems of the flowers had been there. All the auras had been there, and they're still there, he said, and did not know if he should be relieved or appalled by the firmness he heard in his own voice. For right now, why don't you try being neither, sweetheart? His thought, Carolyn's voice, good advice. Ralph locked up his apartment and went out into the dairy of the old clocks looking for a game of chess. We're at chapter 7, but probably just gonna stop it there so that way we don't get into it until next time. Next time, I say. And turn this down a smidge. Well, thanks everyone for hanging out with me tonight on We Are Paradox Media's Late Night in the Rockies. Thank you to all of our friends on We Are Paradox Media's Facebook, KPNL Radio, Twitter, Spreaker, iHeartRadio, and wherever else you may be listening beyond the Omniverse tonight. Had a wonderful time this evening. I can't wait to do it again next weekend when we have the Paradox Paranormal Forum, as well as more story time. Don't forget, we're all in this together. Together we can make the world a bit better. And together, my friends, we are Paradox Media, because without you, there is no us. Until next time, nighty night, love and light. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend and week. And I will see you back here, same time, same place.